yeah, it's just so nice. And like as Robin was sharing in the celebration video, it's so cool that as much as we have our Lift Mac family and that comes and worships, that we're not just a family on one site. The Lift Mohawk family is in our own kind of separate family, but we're actually one big church. And so it's great that I can come to Mac and go to Brock or Guelph, and I still feel like I'm home. Yeah, I'm excited, and I'm excited to be here and share the word. So for those of you that are just joining us or new with us, we're actually in the middle of a series working through the Gospel of Mark. And so when we first got to the series and we were first kind of discussing about kind of going through it, I was like, yeah, sure. Mark, great. Yeah, that'll be awesome. And then we started talking about how long the series was going to be, and I was like, wow, it's a long series on Mark. But I'm going to be honest, church, is that the more time I've actually spent in it, as we've been kind of going through it this semester at all of our sites, I've really just been falling in love with this book. But more than just the actual book itself, I've really just been falling more and more in love with Jesus. The person of Jesus has just been coming alive as we've been going through, and I've just been really, really enjoying it. So I'm excited to get to go through it again tonight with you guys. And so with no further ado, we're just going to jump right in. We're going to be in Mark chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. It should be on the screen any second now. If it's there, say it's there, Dan. Perfect. Mark 3, 1 to 6. Let's jump in. Jesus entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a shriveled hand. In order to accuse him, the Pharisees, they were watching him closely to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. He told the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand before us." And then Jesus, said to them, the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they were silent. After looking around at them with anger, he was grieved at the hardness of their hearts and told the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Immediately, the Pharisees went out and started plotting with the Herodians against him, how they might kill him. Let's pray before we get any further, church. God, it is such an honor to be able to come and worship you tonight. And so, God, my prayer tonight is that let all my words be worship to you. God, let me not come up here and try to speak with clever phrases or my own wisdom, but instead, let me just speak your words. Let nothing I do be out of selfish ambition, but instead, let everything we do just be worship to you. God, let us leave this place a little bit more in love with you and a little bit more in awe of you. Amen. So before we go any further, before we kind of get to the meat of the message tonight, I felt like it would be kind of useful to explain what's going on here, because without the context, this passage can seem sort of weird. There's the Pharisees, and they're trying to trap Jesus, but then there's the healing, and why is this a problem? And so I want to explain this whole concept, and it has to start with the history and the concept of Sabbath. A lot of times when we hear the word Sabbath, we think of Sunday, and it's the day we go to church, and then it's the day we kind of take off and just sort of relax. And so that's what Sabbath means to a lot of us today. But it meant something very, very different. The practice of Sabbath actually started with the story of creation, the 7 days of creation in Genesis. And so the story goes that God worked for 6 days creating everything, creating the world, and on the seventh day he rested. And so the ancient nation of Israel adopted this practice, and modeling it after what God did, they adapted this practice of taking 1 day a week, the seventh day of the week, and actually dedicating that day to God, to stopping work. And now the point of it was actually to direct their attention not to themselves, but actually to direct their attention to God, to realize that, no, God is actually the only one sovereign over our time. God is actually the only one that can actually sustain our needs. And so we're going to take a step back and we're going to stop working. We're going to stop striving to kind of provide for ourselves, stop working to make sure that we're okay, stop trying to advance ourselves, and stop everything and rely on God instead. To direct our attention, to remind us that no, God is sovereign over our time, God is sovereign over our work, that he is the only one that can sustain us. He is the only one that brings us value. And so that's where the practice started, and it was good. But then as time went on, that practice began to change a little bit. And so for anybody that knows the Bible, they would likely know that there's two testaments, two kind of sections of the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's right here-ish. It's right here. Basically divides of the time before Jesus and the time after Jesus. But the Old Testament, what many of you might not know, is that the Old Testament, it goes through and it tracks over a couple thousand years of history, but then it stops about 400 years before Jesus shows up. And in that time, there's basically silence. God sends no new prophets. He sends no new words. And so it's a period of silence from God. And so that time is called like the intertestamental period, like in between the testaments. And so during that time, these practices continued, but they started to take on a little bit of a different flavor, a little bit of a different heart. And so what happened was the Sabbath, it started with this practice of remembering who God is, remembering how sovereign he is, that he brings us value. And all of a sudden it started becoming this point of pride, like, look how good I Sabbath, look how good I ceased working. Yeah, it seems kind of odd, but then they all of a sudden like adding more and more things to what work is as sort of like a competition. And so they started making these extra writings and these extra laws on top of what God said to be like, oh, look at me, how good I am at Sabbathing. Look how good I am at stopping. And so some of them started off with good things, like, okay, you like don't plow your fields, don't do all these things to provide for yourself. It was like, okay, that's solid. And then all of a sudden it started getting a little bit further, and they started making more laws. And all of a sudden somebody's writing like, oh, we should stop waging wars. I'm like, yeah, that's probably a good idea to stop on the Sabbath. But then it gets further, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, if you're not allowed to plow your fields, then if you happen to be walking through and you're a little bit hungry, you can't like pick a piece of grain off of like one of the stems. Like that's work. That's technically it's like reaping, and it's basically the same as plowing, and it's not. But they would say like, oh no, like that's work, so stop doing that. And eventually they got to the point where they were like, oh no, you can't walk more than 1,000 cubits in a day, because if you walk more than 1,000 cubits, that's work. And a cubit's about like the length of my arm. They don't really know, but it's approximately this long. We'll say it's a meter. You can't walk more than a kilometer on the Sabbath, because that's work. And the reason why they kept on doing this is because this point of pride. They kept on adding all these extra laws. Be like, oh, well, look how many of these extra laws I follow as well. Look, like I'm especially holy. I'm especially righteous. Look at all the extra laws that I abide by. I really, really don't work on the Sabbath. I'm awesome at Sabbathing. And so at this point is where Jesus shows up. And one of those extra laws that they had that said that, oh no, this was work on the Sabbath, would have been healing somebody, would have been actually trying to help somebody. And so somewhere along this way, this good thing, which is healing, got put into the concept of work. And so when Jesus shows up, they know that Jesus' heart is for people, and he shows up and there's a person that needs to be healed. And instead of them being there trying to support or care for this man, they're like, oh, I know what we're going to do. That Jesus, he's going to try to heal. And so they go there and they're trying to trap him. And they're going to try to, in their own pride, elevate themselves and lower down Jesus and say, Jesus isn't as righteous as we are, because he would go and he tried to do good on the Sabbath. He tried to heal on the Sabbath. And we are trying to be so righteous. The Pharisees are trying to put themselves above, trying to show just how good they are and how bad Jesus is, so that they would go and try to trap him. So here's the thing, it's easy to sit here and kind of like laugh about the Pharisees, like, oh, that's kind of dumb. But we do the same thing. It might not look the exact same way, but so often we do the same thing where we take Sabbath, something that was meant for good, and actually twist it around and focus it on ourselves instead. So many times I've talked to people and they talk about how Sabbath is a day of rest for them. It's a day that for them to recuperate. They're so tired, they work so hard, and they know that like God wants them to take them a day off. And so we take a day off. I need a day for me. I need to make sure I prioritize and I keep my time sacred. Time to relax, time to rest. But that never was the point of Sabbath. Sabbath is about giving time to God, not about taking time for ourselves. See, Sabbath originated with the creation story of God creating for 6 days and resting and ceasing work on the seventh. But here's the thing, is that God didn't rest on the seventh day because he was tired. He's God. He wouldn't have become tired. God rested on the seventh day because he was satisfied. And so to our call, if for something like Sabbath, isn't to go and to rest, to take time to rest on the seventh day because we're tired, but actually to cease work because we know that God will satisfy all of our needs. It's so easy in moments like these to take something good and holy and to turn around and look at ourselves. I was here a couple weeks ago and I preached about how we do the same thing with church. We come with this consumeristic mindset and we're just constantly looking at ourselves. We come with this individualistic mindset. We come with our selfish ambition. But it's so easy and it's so natural to take something good and holy and meant as worship and twist it around to look at ourselves. And here's the thing, like when I say this because it's so easy for me to do this as well. Anybody that has heard me preach before might pick up a pattern that I preach basically the exact same prayer every time I open up a passage, every time I open up a sermon. It's some sort of riff off like, hey, God, let this be worship and let it not be about me, but let it be about you. And the reason I pray that every single time is because I need to. Every fiber of my being, every urge that I have wants to come up here to seek your admiration, to seek your praise. I want to come up here and I want people to look at me and be like, wow, he did such a good sermon. Wow, he's so wise. I want your admiration. I crave it with every fiber of my being that I want people to look at me with admiration. I want to take something sacred and holy and meant for good, like me, that's supposed to be coming here to model Jesus and to encourage us and to lead us into worship. And instead, everything in me wants to make it all about me, not Jesus. It is the most natural impulse to turn and make things about ourselves, but it is also the most broken and most destructive impulse. The Pharisees were so focused on their own power, on their own righteousness, and in looking good, that they were willing to let somebody in need go without so that they could look good. They were so focused on their own power that they were willing to conspire with their mortal enemies to murder the very Savior that they were supposed to wait for. So the Pharisees, they were expecting a Savior, they were expecting a Messiah, and they should have actually been paving the way for Jesus, just like I'm here to model Jesus to you and to try to show you guys Jesus. The Pharisees were there to try to show and pave the way for the Messiah. But looking at themselves, instead of recognizing the very one they were waiting for, they murdered him instead. And they teamed up with their mortal enemies to do so. They were so focused on the Sabbath being about themselves. We can get so focused on the Sabbath being about ourselves that we miss the point, the very point of it. See, it's not that rest is bad. Rest is good. Please get more rest. Go to sleep at a proper time tonight. But the Sabbath was never about your rest. It was never about you. It was about God. So I don't know about you, but I don't want to follow the Pharisees' example here. I don't want to follow their example about making this all about me or looking always at the negative and being critical. So instead, I want to take us on a little bit of a different journey. See, it would be so easy to kind of make the rest of this sermon basically talking about how much the Pharisees sucked, because they did. And it'd be so nice and easy to kind of go and make this entire, this big critical sermon about the Pharisees. But as Robin preached last week, complaining doesn't actually do anything. So instead, I'd actually like to spend the rest of the sermon, the majority of the sermon, focusing on Jesus. Focusing on the author and perfecter of our faith. Just like it is my job to try to model Jesus to you, let's look at what he does and let's try to model it ourselves. Believe it or not, it's the whole point of this series is to actually focus on Jesus. And so I'm actually really excited because Jesus in this passage is actually really fun to talk about. He's a little spicy in this one. No, but it goes and it talks about him getting angry. And like, if you read the Bible, like Jesus doesn't actually get angry a whole lot. And so it's fun to talk about these things. I don't know about you guys, but growing up, I always pictured Jesus as this like super solemn and stoic individual. He's always serious. He's always just really spiritual. He's soft-spoken maybe. But he's not that way in this passage. And so I love these moments. I love when we can humanize Jesus and when we realize that, no, like he actually felt every human emotion. In the first service, I kind of just went off and I was talking about this movie that came out a number of years ago, The Passion of the Christ. And I didn't talk about how it may or may not be problematic and all the different things, but I talked about one scene in particular. There's one scene where Jesus goes and apparently invents chairs. It's a thing, just don't worry. But he sits there, he invents a chair or something, but that's not the point of the sermon. It's not about chairs. Also, we have new chairs. It's great. The thing I love about that scene is that he shares this moment laughing with his mother, laughing with his family. And I remember as a young boy seeing this movie being like, wow, I have never before in my life thought of Jesus laughing. Thought of Jesus happy, thought of him angry. And so today we're not going to look at the laughing Jesus, we're going to look at the angry Jesus. But it's fun nonetheless. And it's awesome being able to look and realize, Jesus, he felt all the emotions that we feel. And so in this passage, he's angry. But it's important to look at the situation about why he's angry, because the Pharisees were angry too. And we understand the situation behind them, but what makes Jesus different? And so I want to look at three things. I want to look at who Jesus is angry at, why Jesus is angry, and what does he do about it? We know the answer to these three questions for the Pharisees. The Pharisees were angry at Jesus. That's the who. The why they were angry was because Jesus was going and he was living an upside-down life, and he was threatening to take away their power and prestige. And what they did about it is they tried to murder him. They actually succeeded, but that's what they did. And so we could understand that don't follow their example, but let's look at Jesus and see what he did. So we're going to jump into verse 4 again. Should be on the screen. Verse 4, then he, Jesus, said to them, the Pharisees, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? To save life or to kill? But they were silent. After looking around them with anger, he was grieved at the hardness of their hearts and told the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And so that first question, who was Jesus angry at? I want to first look and say, obviously it's the Pharisees, but I want to first look, who wasn't Jesus angry at? Who did he not confront right now? Because there's a lot of people he could have. In this moment, he could have gotten angry at the Roman Empire, which is kind of ruling the systems at the time. He could have talked about how there needs to be more systems in place, more endeavors made by the Roman Empire to kind of take care of people who are injured. He could have said that, no, the government, the people in power, it is their job, their responsibility to take care of the less fortunate, and there should be systems in place to kind of fix these things. Jesus could have been angry at the family members of this man. He could have blamed them, being like, why aren't they here taking care of him? Why aren't they trying to get him medical help? Why aren't they supporting his needs? He could have even gotten angry at the man. It doesn't say why his hand was withered, but maybe it was an injury. Maybe we're like, well, this was his own fault. He could have avoided this situation. There's all sorts of people Jesus could have actually been angry at. But the people he does actually critique are the Pharisees. But the thing we need to realize, church, is that the Pharisees were his people. Jesus was a Jew. He was a member of the nation of Israel. And so he would have considered the Pharisees his brothers and his sisters. The Pharisees were his in-group. They were the people he would have been closest with. And so when Jesus is casting a critical eye, he's not looking at others. He's not trying to blame others. Instead, he's actually looking at his own group and saying, hey, why aren't we doing more? So we need to ask, like, who church are we critical of? Because we could sit here and we can complain about the government and talk about how they need to be doing more for our communities, that there needs to be more endeavors into social justice, that they need to be taking care of the homeless, they need to be taking care of the widowed, they need to be taking care of people in our communities. It's the people of Hamilton's job to be taking care of the people down on Barton Street or those that are less fortunate. It's their job. Why aren't they doing enough? We can get angry at Trudeau and the election. We can complain about the first past the post system and how it's, well, they won the general election, but we can complain about all these things, but I don't see Jesus doing that. We could condemn others. We could look at those in society and be like, oh, well, like, it's his own fault or their own fault from what they're doing, or like, oh, well, it's because of just how sinful the world is. We could even blame other churches, be like, oh, well, like, if other churches were doing their job, like, we're doing so much already, we try so much. If other churches were pulling their weight, then maybe actually a little bit of good would be done. But church, I don't see that in the Bible. What I see Jesus is saying is looking to his own community, looking to those he's closest at to be critical. And so, church, I would say that out of this passage, that those that we should be critical about is ourselves. That before looking at anybody else and trying to cast blame or throw blame or be critical of anybody else, we need to actually first look inside of ourselves. See, it's so tempting to cast blame, to be critical of others, because it makes ourselves feel good. It can be so tempting as a church to look at other churches and be like, oh, well, like, we're doing so much more than these other churches, and kind of fill up our pride a little bit. It's so tempting, church, to even compare my site to all the other sites. There's an ever-going temptation to go and to, like, look up all the numbers of, like, oh, well, where was Brock when they were at where I was at? And, like, try to track these things, and we're like, oh, well, like, they were good at this way, but we're actually better at these ways, and we'll go off, and, like, there's such a temptation to fill my own insecurity and to fill my own pride by comparing and competing against everybody else around me. But I can tell you, church, nothing will destroy the unity of our church faster than comparing and competing between our sites. Nothing will destroy the unity and destroy our ability to bring and usher in Christ's kingdom than us blaming other churches. And nothing will get in the way of us actually trying to do good in this world and to reach people for Jesus than for us to be critical and blaming others. No, church, our call is to look at ourselves. And I want to give a bunch of examples of how this actually can play out in our lives. And the first example I want to use is the leadership at Lift. Every single week, our leaders at Lift have a moment where we meet together at 7:30 a.m. on Wednesdays. And part of that meeting every single week is a time we call it fail/make it better. We talk about how our church is failing and how we're not doing good enough and how we can actually make it better. But here's the thing, church. We don't do this out of pride. We don't do this out of fear or insecurity. We do this out of love. We love this church dearly. And we believe so much. We see so much potential in this church so that we will not rest and will not be okay with the status quo. So instead, we're constantly looking for ways that we can do more, that we can do better, both ourselves personally, but also us as a corporate body. How can we be better? How can we make it more? How can we have a greater impact? I can tell you, church, nobody loves this church more than your leadership. And because of that love, nobody is more critical of this church than your leadership. Not because we're not doing good, but because we believe that we can do so much more. It's not a critique from afar, but a critique with our skin in the game. a close examination by those who love this church dearly and wanted to see it be the church that we know it can be. And so this leads to the next question: why was Jesus angry? And likewise, Jesus wasn't angry in that moment out of fear or pride or guilt or shame or insecurity. But instead, Jesus was angry based out of love and compassion. Jesus loved the Pharisees deeply. Jesus came to die on a cross, to go through a horrendous death for the Pharisees. He loved these people so much. They were his chosen people. And so because he loved the Pharisees so much, and because he believed in the Pharisees so much, and because he saw so much good in the Pharisees, that's why he was angry. He was angry because he loved them and he knew that they could do better. He knew that they were missing the point. And so his heart was grieved, it was saddened, because he knew that they could be so much more. He knew that they were meant not to look for themselves, not to elevate themselves, but actually to serve others, to serve the world. Church, we are not meant to elevate ourselves, to serve ourselves, but to serve the world. Just like the Pharisees, we were not made for our own sake. In my Simple Church huddle this week, we talked about individualism. And we talked about how so often we come and are seeking our own glory, or even good things kind of get turned into looking at ourselves. See, that's why we were so often unsatisfied when we ask about what our purpose is, and we're like, oh no, our purpose is to glorify God and to help others glorify him. The reason that doesn't satisfy us is because we want to know what our purpose is. Like, what's my purpose? Like, I get that that's our purpose, but like, what's my purpose? As if you're somehow supposed to have a purpose outside of the community we're called to. We're so often looking at ourselves. But the thing is, church, when we're so focused on ourselves, we overlook the needs of others. When we're so focused on coming to church to talk to those we're closest to hang out with our friends, we overlook the people sitting by themselves that need somebody to talk to them, the people that went through a hell of a week and just needed somebody to be their friend. And when we're so focused on finding those that we enjoy talking to, we miss and we overlook those who need us most. And the most radical thing about this is that when Jesus was angry at that, when he was angry at the Pharisees, the thing he wasn't angry about was that the Pharisees were about to kill him. See, he knew that. He knew that these were the very people going to kill him. But he wasn't angry about that. He was angry that they were missing the point, that they were perpetrating an injustice. And so Jesus' example here is being angry at injustice, even at the expense of himself. And so, church, our response to this should be to pray and ask God that he will break our heart for injustice, both for the physical needs of our communities, but also for those who need the hope of Jesus. Our prayer, church, should be God to open up our eyes to those that need a friend, those that are lonely, those that are without hope, and that he will open our eyes and that he will break our hearts. Our prayer should be that we can focus and that he can help us focus our eyes outwards, not inwards. Our prayer should be that our hearts are breaking not for the 200 to 300 people that are here on a Sunday night, but for the 29,000 people that go to this campus, that go to this school that don't know Jesus. And our prayer, church, should be that our anger is always based out of love and compassion. Many of us have had a friend who has been in a toxic relationship, a relationship that's just no good, that they need to get out of. And we can get angry at that moment, that we see this and we're upset and we're angry because we know that they could do so much better. That is a love, and that is the anger that Jesus is showing here. I was talking to one of my Simple Church leaders this week, And he was so frustrated because he was trying to get his simple church to open up and to be vulnerable. And he was trying to lead in vulnerability. And he was meeting with his simple church one-on-one. And then he was having a great conversation in his huddle. And he was just trying to get his simple church just to open up and to really talk about the real issues going on in their lives. And they just were refusing to do so. And so he was so frustrated. Not for his own sake, not out of fear or insecurity, but he was so frustrated because he knows that the very best thing for his simple church would be to open up, to lead, to join him in vulnerability. And so he was angry because they were so close. They could see what was best, but they constantly are averting their eyes and instead looking at themselves and letting fear and insecurity and pride rule. That's the anger we're talking about. That's an anger based out of love and compassion. That is a Jesus kind of anger. And so the final question we need to ask is okay, what we understand that Jesus is angry at those that he's closest to, that he has the people that he has a relationship with. And he does that out of love and compassion because he wants them to succeed and he wants them to do better. But the question is, what is Jesus' response to this anger? And so we see that in verse 5 again. After looking around at them in anger, he was grieved at the hardness of their hearts. And he told the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Jesus doesn't complain. At this point, after this anger, he doesn't go and condemn, or he doesn't yell at the Pharisees. He doesn't go write a strongly worded Facebook post. He doesn't allow his anger to control him. He doesn't pronounce judgment. No, he goes and does the right thing. He goes and heals the man. He serves others. Jesus' response to injustice, Jesus' response to the anger he was feeling wasn't to condemn, but instead to bring hope and joy and mercy in the world. Jesus' response to seeing people not fulfilling their calling is actually to go and model what it looks like for them. Jesus goes and steps into the situation. He leads the way. Instead of complaining about injustice, instead of critiquing or chastising the Pharisees, he instead goes and shows them what they could be. He shows them what they could do. And here's the encouraging thing, church, is that we're actually very good at this here at Lift. We're very good at when we see a need, we go and we step into that need and try to serve. This is the story of Serve Our City, of the entire serving vector. The story of Pinky Lewis began with a simple church seeing a need in a community at Barton and Sanford. And what they didn't do is they didn't complain. They didn't hope that the city would go and issue some social justice programs to go and make things better. They didn't try to hope that the entire socioeconomic breakdown of our country would change. But no, they stepped into a relationship and they stepped into a messy situation to bring Jesus and to bring hope and to bring light. And it wasn't perfect, and it was and still is a mess every single week. And they can't fix all the problems, but they stepped into that situation and did what they can. And every week they step into that situation and still do what they can. They were angry at social inequality. They were angry at the injustice that was facing this country, this city, and that neighborhood. And so they stepped in and did the right thing. They stepped in and did something about it. See, we are called to be agents of change in this world. We often talk about this idea of secure identity. And so we talk a lot about our identity being secured as a child of Christ, and that's good and that is true. And we also talk about how part of our secure identity is being a slave or a servant of Christ, and that is also true. But something we don't talk as much about is our identity of being an ambassador of Christ. Someone who represents Jesus. That everywhere we go, our identity, the very core of who we are showing those around us Jesus. We are meant to be Jesus in this world. And Jesus turned culture upside down by living a radical life of sacrifice. And so too, we are called to turn our culture upside down, not by complaining, not by chastising those around us, but by living this incredibly upside down, different, radically sacrificial life. Some of you might know Graham White. He attends here. He was one of the ministry apprentices last year. He produces the webcast. And there's one moment he shared at the Rubik's an excerpt from a book he was reading. It was a book of common prayer. And it shared this excerpt that struck me so deeply. And it was a prayer to God, and it was a prayer asking God to make us creators of holy mischief and disturbers of peace. And it just resonated so deeply in me. Like, number one, yeah, I want to be up to some mischief. But more so, church, I want to be someone who disturbs peace. I want to be someone who pushes those around me out of their comfort zone, who calls us, instead of a life of comfort and safety and ease, into somebody and a church that is radically sacrificial, that to be going places that are dangerous, to live a life of sacrifice, to live a life following Jesus' example. See, Jesus didn't worry about what other people's reactions would be. And spoiler alert, the reactions kind of sucked. They killed him. It's true, it's in there. But here's the thing, church, we're probably not gonna, at least in our country, be murdered for our faith. But are we willing to still sacrifice? Are we still willing to be outcast from our friends? Are we willing to have people think that we're weird? Are we willing to maybe accidentally offend somebody? Are we willing to live a life so upside down that our own family isn't sure what's going on, that thinks we're weird or thinks that we're being unwise? I can tell you, church, when I decided to come and join Lyft, I had a number of people tell me that I was not making a wise decision, that I was being foolish with my finances. When I decided to come and join the ministry apprenticeship, people were like, why would you go and be an intern for a year and not even get paid for it? I know for a fact some of the other apprentices that have gone and dedicated a year of their life, that they've had people be like, well, this is foolish. Why would you go and do this? You went through an entire schooling to try to get a job in a certain field. Why would you abandon that? I can tell you that your leadership has done that. Robin had so many people think he was a fool for leaving his job. Tara had so many people that think that she was weird or a fool for leaving her job. Mel has had her boss think that she's crazy for asking to take a day off so that she can serve at the church. They're following Jesus' example of being willing to sacrifice and live a life upside down. Not for their own glory, but because they saw a need and they're like, yeah, I'm going to go and I'm going to fill that need. They didn't worry about what other people's reactions would be. I want to tell you a story as I'm finishing up. This was a couple years ago, and I went to a conference. And there's like 500-600 other leaders of churches, people that have been in ministry for I was actually probably one of the youngest and probably one of the newest in ministry there. People have been there probably 60 plus years. A large group of people leading churches. And so at the end of this conference, there was a moment where the person that was leading was like, hey, you know what? Like, we're all here and we all give a lot. Let's just have a moment. Let's just come to the front for prayer. Like, we could all use prayer. Just come to the front if you're feeling a little bit weary and you could use a little bit of prayer. We could all use prayer. And I can tell you, church, that in that crowd of 500 to 600 leaders of churches, nobody went to the front for prayer. Because every single person was so worried about what the people beside them would think. One person on the far left went up. And I was sitting there, church, and I can tell you that in that moment, me, this young guy, just brand new to leadership, I was angry. I was angry at the people that I should be looking up to, angry for people that have been in ministry and leading 10 times the length that I had been. I was angry because I could see what they could be, and I was angry that they weren't fulfilling their potential. And so what I did, church, in that moment was I got up and I said something a little bit ruder than, fine, I guess I will. And I walked to the front. Because if nobody else was going to set that example, then I would. And now I don't tell this story to be, oh, look at me. And I don't tell the story to be like, cast critique on other pastors and other churches. I tell this story is that if I, in that moment, one of the youngest in that room, could go and actually lead the way by example, anybody here could do the same in their circles. So often we look at ourselves and think, oh, I'm too young. Oh, I'm not in leadership. I don't have an actual official position. Oh, I'm so new to being a Christian. I was new at that point. I was young at that point. I had no official leadership. Nobody had any reason to follow me. But my call at that moment was the same as every single person in this room's call, which is to lead an example. And when I saw a need, and when I saw people not doing what they should, when I saw people not fulfilling their calling, I stepped up and I decided to model it for them, and I would lead by example. We are called to follow Jesus' example. And so if we see injustice, if we see people missing their mark, we're not called to criticism. We're called to step in and show them a higher way, a better way. Coincidentally, that was the day I met Robin for the very first time. I don't know if that's actually significant. It's cool. It's a nice day, and I like it. I have a microphone. And so, again, as I finish up, and as I really need to finish up, a worry of mine was that this passage would feel heavy, that this would be a weight thrown on you. See, a constant fear of mine while preaching is that when I preach harder sermons, that the people that are listening and the people that are actually living this out will feel like they're not doing enough, that people that are doing a great job would be discouraged. And that is not my heart, church. You see, our church is actually incredible at this. The story of Lift is people seeing a need and saying, yeah, you know what, I'm going to step in and I'm going to fill it, even though I might not supposed to. I literally have like so many examples written down of examples of people that saw a need, and even though they didn't need to, they stepped up and decided to fill it. We can talk about Emily, who wasn't any sort of official leader, but went down to Brock for summer and saw that there wasn't really any sort of prayer team. And so she stepped in and she's organizing this, and she's providing leadership, and then she's organizing worship nights and prayer nights for the entire church at Brock. I could talk about Kirsten and Adam, who are part of this family and saw a need at Mohawk. And so they went and were like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to sacrifice so many of my friendships and go and serve at a place that I know nothing about because I feel God called me and I saw a need there. I could talk about Taylor Miner, who went down to Brock and saw a need for Serve Our City and decided to step in. I could talk about all the Simple Church, literally every single Simple Church leader and apprentice at Guelph, who have no sort of idea. They're brand new to this whole thing. And all of a sudden they have more people and they're like, I guess I will Simple Church apprentice and lead, and I don't know what this looks like, but sure. I could talk about Ina, who is, I think, somewhere in the room, or definitely was last service, and Ina, who decided to step out, and when she was going to Toronto, we're like, hey, do you want to do something never done before? Let's just try this out. Will you step into this need and lead? I can talk about the literally entire network team that I already talked about who sacrificed and stepped into needs. I can talk about every single Serve Our City initiative that we have, from Pinky Lewis to Westside to Ronald McDonald House to Red Frogs. I can talk about every single ministry apprentice that have gone and sacrificed an entire year of their lives saying, hey, you know what? I want to show up, and I don't know what this is going to look like. I don't know if I'm ready, but I am willing to sacrifice so much for the sake of the kingdom. I can talk more about literally every single leader. I talk about like Rebecca seeing a need on the welcome team when she first showed up. I could talk about literally every single one of our sites. The story of Lift is people stepping out into a place, seeing a need and saying, I'm not going to let that need go unfulfilled. I am going to step in and fill it, both across the board in these big kind of grandiose ways, but in the smallest ways of, hey, I see a need on this team. Hey, I see somebody sitting by themselves, so I'm going to go and talk to them. It's not just big sacrifices like Robin. It's little sacrifices like Stephen Kessler in the last service, seeing somebody walking out without them not talking to anybody. And so he ran and talked to them. It can be somebody like Dylan, who saw a gentleman come and sit down by himself last service and went and sat down and talked to him. The story of Lift is small and big decisions, but it's a story of people sacrificing and seeing a need and stepping into this. And so, church, I want to end this sermon in a place of encouragement and empowerment, but also challenge. See, I am so proud of our church for embodying Jesus. But because I'm so proud and because I love it so deeply, I know that we can do more. And I know that God is so proud of this church, but is also calling us, church, to do more. And so where I want to end this, church, is a challenge. And I want to challenge you all to sit and take a moment. And as we do worship and as you go home tonight, I want you to pray and ask God to look inside yourselves, look inside of what we're doing and look for the needs. For God to open up the needs inside of our church. And then after we actually look at a critical glance and see where are actually the needs, I want you to pray and ask God to start breaking your heart. That when you see a place that you feel God is sending to you for you to go, I ask for you to pray for God to increase that burden on you. And then I want you to pray and ask God to give you the courage to go. And again, this may look big, this may look small. Maybe you feel like God is calling, and maybe the need that is going to put on your heart is going and tilling and following Ina's footsteps and tilling at another campus. Maybe it's doing a huge sacrifice and joining for the ministry apprenticeship, which the applications are closing soon. Maybe it's to plant a church. Or maybe it's something small. Maybe it's that the next time you come here, maybe it's sending a message to somebody that you know. Somebody that wasn't here tonight, I just asking them how they are. Maybe it's actually saying yes to your simple church leader that's been bugging you to be an apprentice for a while. Maybe the step that God wants you to take is for you to take a moment and look around and see what teams have a little bit of need. Maybe it's to go and serve at Server City. Maybe it's to go and talk to Nicole about how you could serve with international students. Maybe what God wants you to do is to not follow the footsteps of all those pastors from my story, and it's just to come to the front tonight and actually get some prayer. Here's the thing, church, whether it's big, whether it's small, I know that you were called. You were called to be a disciple-making disciple, and you were called to bring hope into this world. And that hope's name is Jesus. Whether it be solving physical needs, whether it just be bringing people purpose, Jesus is the one that brings lasting hope and lasting change into this world. And our calling is to bring Jesus into this world, to help people be fully alive in the hope of Jesus, to be ambassadors representing Christ, bringing Jesus into the world around us, being agents of change, being disturbers of peace, being an ambassador of Christ. Let's pray.